Hello, everybody. Welcome to the 10th and final installation of the Horizon Knowledge Series. We are your hosts, Sean Benson, and my name is Ian Newman. This topic is going to be on actioning your Archibus system, bringing everything together, all the concepts we've learned over the last, all 9 sessions, but it's going to be longer than 9 weeks. So bringing everything together, showing you how you can put everything together, make everything work for your specific organization. Really get into the kind of the customization end of things. If you have any questions during the session, you can put it in the chat box or in the questions. I will get to them, or simply raise your hand and I can answer it at the end. We have a full catalog of all the slideshows available, so if you would like those, send me an email at the end and I can send you all 10, as well as the final recording will be up on Monday or Tuesday next week of this, so you can go back and watch it. And look out and keep a lookout for anything else that'll be coming after this. I know we have some plans for the demo videos overall from the past sessions. So with all of that said, Sean, I'll give you the floor.
Okay, thanks, Ian. Today's topic and the last topic in the series is actioning your Archibus system. And what we're really talking about today is performance metrics in the system. It's a licensed product. As usual, Ian is your host, and my name is Sean Benson. I'll be presenting today. This is the 10th in the 10-part series, knowledge series on Archibus, and this is our last one. So the idea here is that we've talked a little bit about service desk and assets and building information modeling, preventive maintenance procedures, capital planning, compliance, space reservations, hoteling, and costs and financials. And now we're ready to kind of build a landing page where we have metrics that we can use to take in action. As usual with these knowledge series sessions, we're going to start out with a little bit of a discussion of opportunity, and then we'll jump into this Archibus steps for developing what we'd call actionable metrics. So just to talk a little bit about opportunity, I think when you have a system like Archibus, which with multiple domains and many different departments using for different reasons, whether it's leasing or space, maintenance, the opportunity is to actually report on and identify metrics associated with the data that you're producing. So the opportunity here is, number one, take action toward your goals. Use the system to tell you what to do about what's going, what you can do better. And obviously, as you take action and as you make changes, use those metrics to demonstrate the progress that you're making. And these are things, goals are things like cost reduction, your health and safety for your workers. Workplace satisfaction is becoming a big part of facilities now, as well as sustainability and energy cost reduction and so on. So there's all sorts of goals that we all have now. And there's and Archibus is a big system, and it's worth taking a step to make sure that all of that data is reaching you and becoming actionable. So I want to just point out, this is what performance metrics are in Archibus. There's a lot going on the screen, but basically the idea is that when you log in on the left-hand side of the screen here, you log into a landing page where you've got some information at your fingertips, and even just visually, it lets you know that there's something that has to get done. So you'll see that there are a series of metrics on this page related to, for example, weekly occupancy and the number of seats or the number of employees you have, the average area per seat, total area, whether it's gross or rentable or usable, number of occupants that can fit in the building, leases coming due in the next month, vacancy rates, all sorts of things. And each of these metrics is associated with red, yellow, and green stoplight colors, which basically let you know if those particular metrics are good for you, are out of range, or are getting into an area that are not going to be good for you in the company. So this is what we're talking about when we're talking about making Archibus actionable. I mean, we're on the front page, put on each role's landing page something that they can use to see how they're doing and measure their progress. And the nice thing about metrics is you can then drill into these details, these metrics, by granularity, by building, by department, by room category. As you can see, there's a variety of different options that you can look at these metrics in. And the nice thing is each metric then connects or can be connected to its own specific report. So if you wanted to drill in further and look at, specifically what building is it that's going over, or what has a higher occupancy or less of an efficiency rate, you can actually go into the specific report that you want to call up for that and then decide what to do about that. So we're going to be talking about performance metrics today. The results of using performance metrics, as we said, are two things. One, that you can by default take a look at what's happening on the screen, drill into a report or a view that's specific to the details that will help you make a decision. And at the same time, I don't know if you know, but metrics are connected to the email system. So if you have a threshold associated with the metric or a couple of thresholds, you can have an email automatically kick off to someone to let them know, hey, we've reached this threshold and we need to take action on this particular item. Okay, so those are the results. They're for measuring, but also for taking action of your progress or on your progress. We need to talk a little bit about metrics and the concept of metrics, prior to jumping into the Archibus performance metrics steps. As you can see on the left, I threw up a little cartoon here, which I think is kind of funny. It says, our marketing program is clearly successful, as shown by this graph of how awesome I think it is. And I think this is a typical mistake that you make when you start making metrics. There are two types of metrics I think that especially marketers generally look at. One are kind of referred to as vanity metrics, and the other one are more actionable metrics. And what you want to focus on in any system, really, at least for operational side of things, is the actionable metrics. And Archibus, you can get into this same scenario with Archibus. You can start creating metrics that are really more vanity or non-actionable metrics as opposed to making them actionable. So for example, I've listed a few of them that I've seen here, in passing. For example, I would say, non-actionable metrics might be things like, well, how many work orders do you process in a month? What's the percentage of reactive versus preventive work that you deliver? What's the percentage of occupancy in your office buildings? What's your percentage of meeting versus assignable space, rentable versus usable, or an average satisfaction rating? Those will give you useful metrics, right? Useful numbers to compare yourself against. But the question is, are they actionable? Does it tell you you've got to go do something? So although those kind of vanity metrics are nice, they're good for presentations, and they may be good for tracking your progress, you might want to think about creating metrics that force on you an action to take to make things better. So for example, instead of the number of work orders, what about trying to look at work orders that are more than 10% overdue, right? Or sorry, 10% of work orders that are all overdue. Or when you get over 40% reactive work, that might be an issue or a problem area because you really want to keep that reactive percent ratio down below 40%. Instead of talking about or looking at the occupancy in the buildings, why don't you say, hey, if we go over 92% occupancy in office buildings, that's going to be a problem. We're going to be running out of space. Or maybe less than 88%, that might be a problem because now you're paying for space that you're not using. So those types of things make a metric actionable. And you can, when you develop the metrics in Archibus, you can develop your vanity or your non-actionable metrics for, for show or for demonstrations and reporting for measuring progress. But also, I think it works, it's more effective when you think about making them actionable. Thinking about making ratios of two different items, creating a high threshold and a low threshold to determine, when it's time to actually take action. So keeping that in mind, there are a lot of considerations when you go to make a metric in Archibus. And this is tends to be the hard part, not the actual system itself, but thinking about what it is you want. That's the hardest part of the metric. What is going to be useful? So in Archibus terms, one of the things you want to think about are the metrics for different roles the same, or are they different? Do you want to apply VPA to metrics so that different groups can't see certain data? In that case, which sets of buildings and locations do you want? Are there other organization level restrictions that have to be applied to the metric to make them usable? So that might be one consideration. The actual calculation that you're going to use for the metric, for example, where does the data come from, is going to be important as well. Because in Archibus, and the reason why I have this on the screen is because there's usually about 3 or 4 ways to do the same thing. And it's true of metrics as well. If you wanted to look at area, you can get area from the room table, from the floor table, from the building table, and they might be slightly different depending on the way that you want to massage or look at these numbers. So you have to think about where is that data going to be coming from. And then if you are grabbing data from that table, what kind of granularity can you drill into? And again, sometimes you're going to relate metrics to each other, and you have to make sure that the granularities match as well for whatever you choose. Is there going to be a linked report? Do you have a favorite report right now that demonstrates the detail or the operational detail of the metric that you're displaying on the screen? And do you want to link that report to the metric so that users can easily get into that file? What are the target values for the metrics? Is it a percentage? Is it a number, etc.? Are there thresholds, above or below the target value? What direction is the trend that you want to show? Do you want things to be going up, going down? Are they supposed to be on target? That type of thing. Are they supposed to be 0, for example? And then do you also want email notifications to go out whenever you hit those thresholds? So those are things to discuss. And of course, there's always the thought to what is the user's experience, right? So when the user logs in, what is going to be the most useful way to see this metric displayed? Is it going to be by using the building metric, which shows an image of the building with the value on it? Is it a pie chart? Is it a scorecard? Is it an alert style metric with the stoplight colors and so on? So there's about 6 or so kind of standard Archibus what we call display types or control types in the home pages that you can take advantage of. They're not the only ones. There is an ability to customize and create a variety of different charts and graphs and display them in the landing pages. But you might as well start with the things that come right out of the box. So what are the steps for developing these home pages with these metrics? The first 4 steps are here on the screen. And I would say the first 2 steps are probably the most difficult. And that is, number 1, you've got to define your targets, your business targets. So what exactly are you going to find useful and actionable? For example, a satisfaction rating over 4.0 or under 4.0? Do you want 0% overdue requests? Do you want 90% occupancy? Those types of things. A lot of people haven't thought about those, by building or by location. And that's the kind of thinking that has to go into this first. Secondly, you've got to, even though you have this nice idea for your business target, you might not have the data, or you might not be producing the data that's going to support that in the way that you thought. So what you then have to do is look at your system and analyze the data and any potential metrics that it might, support. So for example, you've got to look at things like the available fields that you have. What fields are being populated with data? For example, if I think about work requests, when you enter in work requests, everyone has to enter in a problem type and a location and a description. There's going to be a date requested captured, but you're not necessarily going to have a cause or a repair type. You're not necessarily going to have a date completed by, and so on. So you have to think about which of those data fields are going to be reliable for your metric and which are going to be consistently giving you the same information month after month or week after week. And then there might be restrictions. You might have a field that works very well, but some of the values are null in certain circumstances. So you want to use that field, but you've got to make sure you restrict out all the other records that aren't going to be useful. So those types of restrictions are going to have to be considered. And then of course, alternatives. Where you think you might get your information from might not be the best place to do it. So you always have to think about maybe a better way to get at the information or the result that you want, as opposed to what you think you necessarily need. This came, for example, just really quick example. I had a customer the other day say, Sean, we don't want to we don't want to have to use the time entry field and the description field for all the craftspeople. It's delaying the amount of time that they're using the system on, and then we have to, of course, make a report on those description fields and on the time entry to see how much, what they're doing and how much time they're spending. And I said, well, what's the purpose, or what are you trying to do with this? Why are we using those particular fields? And they say, well, it's hard to tell from the problem type in the system, what exactly is the issue. And so I said, instead of using those fields, why don't we focus on the problem type? And then we know the problem type is consistent. Let's simplify that. Let's make it easier for the user to get the right problem type. And then you're going to have a much easier time reporting. So in that way, rather than kind of sticking with what you think you want, sometimes it is worth kind of thinking out of the box and looking at alternatives to getting the same information. Okay, so that's kind of the fluff, right? That's the paper and pencil work that you have to do before you get to the metrics. But then in Archibus, creating a metric in a homepage does not have to be that difficult. Step 3 is define your page, which means basically create a layout with some existing examples just to get an idea for what you want to, the look and the feel of the page. Then develop your metrics, create the metrics, define all the assumptions, calculations, and so on. And after that, you might want to kind of group some of those into what we call a scorecard or an alert, column. You might want to, and then you're going to have to finalize that page. So after you've created all your metrics and you've figured out the way they want to be displayed, you have to do some kind of final tweaks to the page to make it look nice, meaning you might realize your definitions aren't very good, the calculations aren't quite what you wanted. You need to confirm that these are even useful for the end user, that they are truly actionable in the way that you thought. You might want to display, tweak the number of decimal places, or the color, or the size, or the ratio that you're using. You might even need to resize some rows and columns, and then duplicate and restrict those home pages by different roles or different locations and locales and so on. So that's kind of where a lot of the work happens to making a nice home page. But then lastly, you then have to decide for those metrics where you want to alert somebody with an email, you can then define the actual content of the email that you want. That means subject and body, and then create notification templates to generate metrics for whatever you want to generate emails for. So let's quickly kind of run through these steps, and then we'll move on. So I'm going to hop over into the product now. We'll log in. Let's assume we've gone through and we've done all this analysis and then thinking about the metrics. For example, we might want to do something with work requests, right? Well, before I even hop into here, step 2 says, let's look at the data for work requests. So one of the things I'll always do is I'll just start pulling up data tables and looking at the data that I have and deciding, does it make sense to create a metric on that, or what metrics can we create? So in the work request table, for example, if you look at things like work request code, problem type, date work requested, site and building location, service desk manager, those 6 fields are always going to be available to you in every, and they're going to be filled with consistent data, because in Archibus, a work request has to have a date requested, it has to have a problem type, it has to have a code, and it generally, not always, but it generally has to have a location associated with it. In addition to that, you probably have a department and division, because if an employee makes the request, that employee should be assigned a department and division as well. So these types of fields you can use right away for any kind of reporting on work requests that you want for on demand or whatever it might be. After that, the rest of the fields are going to be conditionally populated with data depending on what you're looking for. So you have to realize that, well, maybe you can't look at completion time, unless you're looking at statuses of completed or not. Maybe you can't use equipment unless you're looking at specifically equipment related metrics and so on. So first thing you do is actually pull up the data tables, look at the data and see what you're looking for. And when you're looking for example, alternatives, maybe it's not the work request table that you're looking for in this example. Maybe it's the work request craftsperson table which has all the timesheet data. So a lot of people will ask for timesheet data and time between work requests. Well, this is also a useful table with all sorts of fields that get automatically populated by the system as you enter information. And you may not realize that that information is being captured, but there's a lot of information in here that you can also use. So maybe it's that table that you want to use. So step 2 is you analyze this data. You look at it, you look for null values and find out what makes sense. Then, like I said, step 3 is go and create the page. So here's an example page with some buildings and some charts and so on. And if you administer Archibus, you'll actually realize there are a few out-of-the-box examples, like the portfolio manager homepage, the environmental manager homepage. As you can see, that gives you an idea for the types of pages you can create. But basically, you can go in and just throw together an example. So that's what I typically do, is I'll go into the system application, go into the add and manager function, and then click on this view called manage home pages and processes. So basically, managing home pages and processes just creates a menu container for the home page. So here's how we do it. We click on add new page. We type in a process, for example, we'll just say Horizon Home. That's going to be our process. The title, it will be something like, I like to stick to kind of short titles, so I'm just going to abbreviate Horizon and call it Horizon. And then you have to have a descriptor file. This may not be obvious to everybody, but basically it has to be the name of an XML file. So the descriptor file has to have a name with a .xml at the end, and it has to be in lowercase. So you fill that in with the name of the home page that you want, and you give it a display order that you want it to show up on the page. These guys up here show up in a particular order because of that display order. Is it active? Yes. And for those of you who've taken the system admin training, you know this is always, or typically always, an activity-based license. So you choose activity ACP for the license level, and you save. Okay, now I've created the menu container. I can go in and edit the page. Now here's an example page. As you can see, it already defines rows. It already creates an individual column. All you've got to do is just kind of play around with a particular layout. So I'm just going to go ahead and throw in a bunch of rows, basically, just to see what it's going to look like. So I'm going to say, let's choose a type, for example, application specific. You're generally going to use application specific for metrics. And then, pick your control type. Like we said, do you want to have buildings on there or not? Now, the nice thing about metrics is if you don't know where to get started, if you don't know where to start with this analysis, you don't even have to. There are actually about 280 predefined metrics within Archibus, and you can go down and choose any of those metrics that you want. So for example, if I want to look for space or occupancy type metrics, I can see there's a space capacity. Well, maybe I want to see building capacity. So let's grab that, press save, and I've now created that initial row with the buildings on it and a capacity potentially. Then I'm going to go down, I'm going to change the row height here to make a small little row. I personally like to fit everything on one screen. So I like to make small rows, 2 or 3 rows that will fit on the screen. And you click on next row, you type in a new panel. This time I might choose again, application specific for the metrics. I might choose a process scorecard, and it says, what do you want to choose? Well, just go ahead and choose one of the existing Archibus ones. The balance scorecard is a nice example. Granularity level, you have to choose at least one, so just make it totals. You don't have to go into by building or department. Do you want to use red, yellow, and green stoplight colors? Yes. If you say no there, you get gray colors on the screen. Column span, always 2, you press save. Okay, now I've got my scorecard. Next one, I might want to do a map. The map also takes up 2 columns. Again, application specific. Control type is a map. Again, metric name. You choose something that is related to buildings or equipment because those have latitude and longitude. So I might put in something like EAM cost, equipment cost monthly. That may produce nothing, who knows? Again, you need to choose a granularity, red, yellow, and green, yes. And then in this particular case for the map, you have to identify, what's the location. So this is going to be the equipment table, and ESRI is the mapping function. So that's now created 2 rows of a home page. I'm going to go through a 3rd row, and I can just go ahead and I can continue on just playing with a layout that I might want to use later on. Again, I'm going to choose an alert. The alert says, what's the scorecard? I'm going to choose one of these predefined asset alerts. Choose all. It doesn't really matter what you're choosing right now because all you're doing is creating a layout where you're going to envision the metrics. So I click on publish. That is going to save the home page, generate an HTML file, and assign it to my role. Now, when you do this for other roles, you do have to go through another process where you assign, of course, the processes to roles, and then you have to publish the home pages as individual steps. But for testing purposes, all I've got to do is assign this page and then go out, and log back in to take a look at it. So I'll log out, log back in. And in theory, I've got something that I've just created. I got a building metric with capacity. I've got a predefined scorecard that Archibus created for me. I've got a map which is not set up with the right column length. There's no data showing up, fine. And then I've got my alerts down at the bottom with no title, but it's already giving me leases due this month, property transactions. So Archibus is already kind of in some cases generating data that you might not even be aware of that will show up. But again, the point of this is not to get a good looking page, it's just to start playing with the layout. And what I mean by that is once you have this guy set up, you can go into the manage home pages and processes and edit that page just by moving things around. So for example, if I want that particular panel up on the top and I want to move this guy down, you just move him around, you change the size of the rows. You can move an entire row up above, here. You can move buildings down below. You just click on republish again, press OK, log out, log back in. And I've got a totally different page. So, okay, I can play with that later, but now I've got a starting point, right? Now you go in and based on those metrics, we go back to step 4, which is to develop the metric itself. So I'm just gonna go back and kind of remind us of where we are. We talked about analyzing data. We defined a basic layout for a home page just for fun using existing examples of scorecards and metrics. And now we're gonna go in and do kind of the meat and potatoes, which is identify our own metrics and define them. And I'm gonna show you just the simplest way to do this. Or I should say, I'll start with a very simple metric. So we go back into Archibus, we go back into System, we go back into Add-in Manager, and just below the Manage Home Pages is a section called Tracking Metrics. You click on Define Tracking Metrics, and here's where you get to kind of create your metrics. Now I'm just going to show you an example of one. I think it's let's choose the capacity one, right? I'm not going to create a new metric today, but I'll show you an existing one because I think this is pretty simple. This is a pretty good example of how easy it is to create a metric with Archibus. I know it doesn't visually show you what's happening, but if you're familiar with your data tables, this is going to be pretty easy to set up. Number one, you want to start with some informational data for the metric. These are basically assumptions that you're going to define. It's really for documenting the metric for the next person who comes along and has to understand it, as well as the user who, when they're looking at the page, understands what red, yellow, green is and why it's that way. So the top portion of the screen, you don't have to fill out in too much detail, but for me, it's really important because for me, the user understanding what they're looking at is key. So the first thing you do is you create a metric name using lowercase letters and dashes or underscores. So just like you have here, space, essential capacity. I tend to put on my organizational prefix. So for Horizon, I would use HORZ or HZ, and then call it, what it is. It's space, it's looking at essential capacity, and how often is it running? It's running weekly. So something like this is a good starting point for a name. I'm messing this all up. And then you just give the metric a title that you want to show on the screen. Now, when you're talking about the home page and the layout, you're now dealing with space, monitor size issues. So when I get to the title, think about keeping this fairly short, but very, specific to what you're looking at. So in this particular case, you don't have to say essential capacity weekly, just call it capacity. People kind of should generally understand what that means. And if you need more, you can put more detail, but you do have a limited amount of space on the page. So a nice short title is a good recommendation. Then describe what this metric is. Why is it important? What's it all about? Explain why the business implication, which is why is this on the screen and what actions should you be taking if you're going over or under your target. And the real important one for me is, what are the assumptions? What assumptions are you making about your data that require that make this metric valuable and valid? So for example, are you using the Space Console to up? I feel like this is a terrible assumption. I guess it doesn't really tell you, what you need. But for example, what I would do is say, look, are you updating the room table with the capacity field for all of your occupiable spaces and leaving everything else zero? And are you using meeting room reservations are using the capacity field for those rooms? Yes or no? This kind of detail I think gives people an understanding of exactly what the metric is all about. But anyway, after you get through the informational stuff, you get into the meat and potatoes, which is the formula of the metric. So by default, now you need to kind of identify what calculation you're trying to run. The system every night is basically going to run a workflow rule. I think it's set to 12 o'clock by default, which will run these calculations that you set up. And the calculations are basically SQL statements that are run against the database. So all this screen is doing is helping you, the non-developer, create a SQL statement as easily as possible. And also at the same time, giving the developer a chance to create any SQL statement they want to use here. So basically, if you're a non-developer, you just have to identify the primary table that you want to get the data from, identify what the aggregate function is you're trying to do. Do you want to summarize the data, find the average, or count the number of records? And then what field or fields do you want to run the metric on? So in this particular case, there's a capacity field in the room table, which is filled with a number, which we can use to summarize to get the overall capacity across the portfolio, okay? As long as we fill in that table and that formula, and you notice in this particular case, they use the formula field colon and then the field name. With an aggregate, that's all you have to do to run the metric. At that point, you could save it and start kind of using it in a way. However, there's a couple things that you might also need to do just to get the results you expect. In this particular case, they said, well, we don't want to include hotelable rooms in this capacity field. So this is going to restrict, this is basically creating a where clause where you restrict out hotelable rooms, right? This hotelable equals 0 means non-hotelable rooms. You're also choosing a recurring rule. How often do you want to capture this metric? Is it monthly, weekly, every day? As you can see, it's pretty detailed in terms of how often you want to run it. You can even run it seasonally if you want. So that's an important field to fill out. And then on the other two tabs, you have a display settings and a granularities. Display settings allow you to describe how the metric is going to show up on the home page. Is it going to show up as a number or as a percentage, as a unit of currency? Are there going to be decimal places, yes or no? And then over here is that trend. Do you want a smaller number? Is that going to look better? Is it going to be highlighting in green things that are going down? Or is larger better? Or is it better to be on target? Or in some cases, as we said, the vanity metric and the number of work orders, there's no significance. It's just a number to let you know where you are, okay? So no significance means basically if you're using stoplight colors on the main screen, the metric is going to show up in blue instead of red, yellow, and green. So that's something to think about as well. And then of course, Archibus does require at least one granularity. So by default, you might want to have a total capacity across the portfolio. The granularity you would choose is all. So when you click on add new and it asks you what you want to group by, you choose all. That's your starting point. And what that does is it gives you a single record every night or every week for capacity. Okay. In addition, you might want to add whatever granularities you want by building, by division, by department. And what that means is, in addition to that one total record, Archibus is also going to generate individual metric records for every building, for every division, for every department, and every other combination of granularities you have. So just this one metric with 4 granularities defined might generate hundreds of actual data records for your homepage. It depends on, again, how much data you have and exactly what you're looking at. So be careful about how much you're asking it to produce, just because you might have a lot of data that's more detailed than you need. So once you've done this, you've created the formula, you created your granularities, you identified whether you have a target or not and how you want it displayed, then you can save the metric, okay? And every time you save it, the status changes. And then once you save the metric, you need to test the metric. So it needs to be tested first, and the system will tell you whether it has been tested successfully. All it's testing is whether the SQL statement runs correctly. In this case, there was some sample data that Archibus included in the product. So all I would have to do is delete the sample data and then run it again. So I'll just do that now. It's deleted, that was quick, and I tested it again, and now it was updated and it was fine. So when that says tested, and this says activated, your metric will start to produce numbers every night. So all you gotta do now is activate the metric, and now I'll wait till this evening or the end of the week to generate the number. And if I put this on the home page, I'll start seeing numbers generated at the end of this week. The nice thing is, after you test and save and activate the metric, this option becomes available for each metric, which is to populate data for prior periods. So if I want to go in and generate the last 12 weeks or 18 weeks of data, by the way, you can only show about 20 values on the homepage itself. So it doesn't make sense to go back, before 20 days or 20 weeks or 20 months, depending on the metric. You can go back to whatever date you want. Like I said, let's go back 3 weeks and collect the data and it generates the data for you so that you'll have some prior periods showing up on your homepage. Okay, and that's the basics of it. Now once you get into all the details, then you have to start thinking about, okay, do I need a more complex formula? Do I want to compare two fields together? You know, do I want to take the head count or do I want to take the capacity and subtract head count? There are a lot of examples in those existing metrics of things like that. So you go ahead and look at all of these 280 metrics and see the types of examples that you can create. So for example, here's a nice little SQL statement, which is going to grab a capacity target from your buildings. And you can use these to copy and create your own. So this is almost an unlimited number of ways to generate this calculation. But remember, keeping it simple is the best kind of solution. Try to come up with a simple vanity number, and then ultimately you can, if you wanted to, take two numbers and divide them by each other. So there's something, and again, we don't have a lot of time to go into huge detail here. This is where the help text and training is useful. But for example, if I had a total capacity and I had a total number of employees, I could divide those two metrics by each other to get that ratio that I'm looking for, and then worry about the targets on the ratio metric that you create. So in some cases, if you're looking for something like occupancy, you might be creating an occupant metric and then a capacity metric and then dividing the two to get the occupancy percentage. That's the type of thing you can get into and you can do. So you can use multiple metrics together to make ratios, but you can also use more complex SQL statements as well. So it's up to you and the capacity of your team and the resources that you have. But that's the main step that you're going to go through. After you've got the metrics done and you're tested them and they're producing data on a regular basis and it's looking good, then we can go back to steps 5, 6, 7, and 8, where we just define, we kind of group metrics together on the page. We make the tweaks to the homepage that we want, and we define email contact. So just again, to show you where that it would be, is there are some other steps. For example, I created my metrics, I've got my layout. Well, if you want to add your own scorecards to the layout, you might have to define a scorecard. So you come in here, you say add new, you give it a code, and you give it another, description, and you say save. Okay, I've now created a new page or a new scorecard, and then you can create the metrics, or you can assign the metrics that you've created to that scorecard. You just have to make sure they're displayed. You have to give them a display order, and then save. And then I can have 5 or 6 metrics that I want to see on the home page in that scorecard. Okay, so that's another step, is developing the scorecards. Same thing for the alerts. All of your alerts are actually just scorecards with metrics that have targets in them. So the target has a threshold, and that threshold will generate an alert, or if we want to, an email. So again, by defining scorecards, you've taken care of your scorecards and alert types of metrics. I've then said you want to go back and finalize the homepage. So after you create all these metrics, now you go back to the initial homepage, and now you take some time to make it look nice. Right now you've got your scorecard, you've got your metrics. You'll go in here, you'll change this scorecard to the new one that you created, so we can delete this here, and we can go ahead and choose a different scorecard, for example, and then choose this one that we want. Okay, and save that. So now we've got that new scorecard here. Same thing for the metrics. You can go ahead and replace this one with one of our own. We can go and replace this one with our own metric. And generally, even if I use an Archibus standard example out of the box, I will usually copy it and assign it my own name, and then start using my own metric. So everything's called Horizon, and I'll just choose from the Horizon metrics to make things easier to find. But you go back in and you just go through this process of making a change and publishing, logging out, and looking at that change and seeing what's happened and how it looks. And you'll see here, this isn't looking great. I've changed the scorecard, but now I need to move this down. I need to move this up. I need to make this a little bit prettier. So I'll go back and forth, and I'll change the colors. I'll look at how the trends are looking. I'll see if those arrows are pointing up, if that trend direction makes sense. I'll see if I want to have people have to click through a variety of metrics, or if I just change the size of the row to get them all on one page. There's all these other considerations that will become obvious to you as you start working on it. So that's the key of, those are the key steps for getting the home page up and running. As we said, after that, once you decide that you've got a good homepage with good actionable metrics, then you can think about defining, for example, notification messages and templates for your emails. And so I'm just going to quickly run into that here. You want to create messages for your subject line and your message body, which means that you can go and create basically a message code, which is for the subject of a particular email that you want to send out. You describe you create a description for that, and then you enter in the message. And it uses some HTML format, so if you want to throw in some HTML here to format your emails, you can, but then you create your message. So in this particular case, it's saying lease, et cetera, is coming due in 90 days. That's a simple message. I save it as the subject. Then I go and create a body for the email. Again, I do the same type of thing. I put in a message code, description, the actual message itself that you want to show in the email, save it, and now you've got your subject and body. To make it actually do something, then you go and create a template. So the template is, for the template, you just simply go in and create a new template. This might be for lease expiration, for example. And you might, again, have things like categories set up. I don't have any categories here for your emails that you want to set up. Otherwise, you can give it a description, again, as you normally do with Archibus. And then the key is to identify the subject ID of the subject you created, and the body ID of the body that you created, which I haven't done, and the actual email addresses that you want to send out to for these notifications. And the important thing is, what is it that's going to generate the email? So basically what you're going to do is you're going to use this particular email notification and assign it to the metrics that you want to generate. So now you have to choose something about what's going to trigger this email. So this is going to, what this is saying is, on the metric date, the date that the metric is run, send an email to these people if the report limit high warning has been reached, the high critical warning, the low critical is reached, or if there's equal. So there's a variety of different kind of conditions under which the email will be sent. And then you can choose to send it a number of times and over a number of days. So for example, I can send it every 2 or 3 days for a maximum of 2 or 3 recurrences. And then if I want to look at my specific granularities, for example, if I want to look at by building or by department, I can break that down to make sure that we can identify who needs to receive these emails. And once you've got that template, then you can go and assign your metrics to that particular template. So you can literally create an email template for each metric that you create to get a very kind of customized experience for email notifications. Okay, now we're kind of running out of time, so I hopefully you've picked up on a lot of that. Normally we'd spend a lot more time kind of going through all the different options for home pages and metrics, but these are the basic steps you need to work through, and the help text will be great to help you out with that. But just to review, the most important part of this is making sure you define what your targets are, understand and be very clear on your targets, analyze your data to see how you can use them to reach those targets and create actions toward those targets. Then it's going to be much easier to define a home page, develop the metrics that will help you take an action, define the scorecards to use that page, finalize the page, and define your email content notifications. So in summary, to get your system actionable, right? You want to make sure that you display actionable metrics on your landing pages. You want to make sure that you notify responsible parties when data becomes actionable or when you're making progress. And ultimately, what you're going to get out of that is demonstrable progress toward business goals, as well as goal-oriented actions that you can take to make sure you're meeting company mission and so on. I hope this was useful for you. This is our last session in the knowledge series. I hope you've enjoyed all 10 series. And as usual, I'll pass this over to Ian for any questions and answers and any final words that he might want to say. Thank you,
Thank you,
everybody.
Sean. I'm not seeing any questions right now, so I'll sit on it for a couple minutes while we wrap up. Like you said, this is the last one, but if you have something that you want to see another knowledge series on, or if there's a certain training aspect that you're interested in, you can send my emails on the screen right now. You can send me an email or Kelly, and we can get back to you and see what we can set up. We have our user groups running right now monthly, so keep an eye out on your inboxes for those. The user groups are a little bit more interactive than the knowledge series. We centered around a topic. We get you guys get some interaction with Nick, Wayne, myself, and answering questions, talking about your use cases and everything else. So if you're interested in that, a new invite will be going out in the next couple of weeks on the next one. And so if don't see any questions, sorry, I was just double checking the question box. Don't see any questions. So like you said, thank you everybody for attending the knowledge series, and we'll see you in the next event.